even though we are a little bit shy this morning, it's fantastic to see all of you who uh, decided to come and share your worship with us and to praise our God. And um, this morning, as we are opening up there to Genesis chapter 6, um, we're going to talk. This will be a slightly different sermon than I've typically done, but I think it would be edifying for us and would help us when we deal with just things that are stated as fact that are not fact. In the secular world, so many things are stated that, the earth is billions of years old, yet that's just not true. And every possible way they come to that conclusion is based on a presupposition that is then also based on a presupposition that is also false. And it's circular reasoning that they get to this conclusion that the earth is, just old as they can possibly fathom it to be. So in Genesis chapter 6, we know we hear the story of the flood. And there are events in Scripture that are so massive that they just don't shape history. And when we think about the cross, like that was the pinnacle of human history. When God came down and dwelt amongst men and then died for our sins. And it left its own mark. But the next biggest thing I think we would agree would probably be the flood when it comes to how it would leave a mark on the earth. And the flood is absolutely the event that I think we can look at the earth today and see the judgment that took place before. So many people say that this couldn't have happened. It had to be a localized flood. There's no way this was the actual whole world. Yet there is significant scientific data being done or studies being done that actually prove the flood happened. And I think this is instrumental when we come to teaching young people. What they're going to be bombarded with is the evolution theory, old earth. That will be a fight that we will have to overcome to maintain faithfulness in our children. So that really is the point here. So if there are questions in this that, what if the Bible is not only telling us what happened, but the world around us still reflects it? So we know we have faith and we trust in the Word of God, but is there evidence elsewhere? And I think we'll be able to come away from this seeing that there's more evidence that the flood existed than that it didn't exist or didn't happen in history. So first of all, when we talk about it being judgment, there in chapter 6 and verse 5, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of his thoughts of his heart was on only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But then we see that Noah finds grace. And the Lord then would then go on to tell Noah that he needed to build an ark and that he was to do it in a certain way. And it was explicit details on how he was going to be able to live through this catastrophic event. We're all very familiar with this, so we're only going to hit some of the highlights as we move through it. But we know in chapter 7, God tells Noah to get on the ark. And then after 7 days, then it would start raining. And it was in the 600 years, in the 600th year of Noah, there in verse 6, when the floodwaters were on the earth. And verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So we see that this is waters from above. We know it's raining, and waters from below that are coming up, and it is covering the entire earth. This is a global event. This is not a localized event. And then in verse 19 through 20, we give evidence of how great this was. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. So if you think about the mountains being covered, that means anything below the mountains was underwater as well. So we're talking globalized flood. There's not a piece of dry land you can find. That is what the text is telling us that happened. And in this act, verses 21 through 23, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostril was the breath of the spirit of life. All that was on the dry land died. So he, being God, destroyed all living things that were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle and creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Think about this. This is a cataclysmic judgment that has been enacted by God because of who man is. And we know that as we move through the narrative, we get this promise that, well, before we get to the promise, I want to talk about it. So it's just not that there was 40 days of rain. Remember, we have the rising water, we have prevailing water, we have the receding water, and then after that, we have dry land. And roughly a year-long judgment is taking place through this process. So a year, the earth is, either the rain has started through the time it's underwater, and then it starts receding, and that receding takes time. Yet, when we think about the whole world being covered in water, a year just doesn't seem to be enough time, but it was. So this flood was not just a single moment. Like when we think of a flash flood, like that's a quick thing. At most, it's a couple of days. You remember back in '94 when Montezuma flooded, it wasn't that long before you just saw some evidence that it had flooded. You saw destroyed buildings and things like that, but nothing to the extent that a year later we would just now be seeing ground. So there should be evidence of this if this took place. And what I want to show this morning is that there is tons of evidence that this took place. And this was enough time for massive sediment movements for the earth. When you think of the violence of water coming up through the crust of the earth, anything that was made of dirt and rock and everything would be crushed, it would be suspended, and it would turn into this milky. Have you ever seen the Flint River after a big rain? It turns nasty. There's so much sediment built into it that all over time or under enough pressure would turn to rock as well. So we have large formations that would end up covering multiple continents, and a large scale erosion you would expect to see during the recession of it. So the scripture gives us the account, but does the earth tell the same story? And this morning, what I want to do is to show you that it does. And I think the first place to start is if there was this flood and you had just 8 people come off that ark, and we know as we think through the biblical narrative that the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and then they go down in the plains of Shinar, and it's there where they build the Tower of Babel. And that's where, God had told them to disperse, and they had not. So he changes the languages. And now they're going to disperse, because if I'm speaking English and you're speaking Hebrew and I can't talk to you, it don't do me no good to stay next to you. I can't communicate with you, and sign language obviously wasn't working for them. So they ended up dispersing. But you would expect there to be some, folklore at a minimum, or stories handed down through generations that there was this flood. And as we think, and I think this is a misnomer, but just to classify who I'm talking about, like uncontacted tribes, those type of things. That's not a real thing, but that idea of people who have over the years have been separated and haven't really been influenced by other cultures, you would think they would also have this story. And that is exactly what we see. We have this story of this flood that is harkened back to in the natives all around the world. You have so many similarities in this. All you really would need is one, that the earth was flooded. And that would do this exercise justice to show that human history remembers this flood. But so many of them included that this was brought about because of man's transgression. And you look at the top of the chart here, shows you this is Assyria, Babylonian 1 and 2, Persia, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, Egypt, Italy, Lithuania, Russia, China, India, Canada. The Cherokee have stories of this, and other Indian tribes here. The Papagayo in Mexico, the Aztecs, Peruvians, Leeward Islands, the Fiji Islands, and Hawaii. And the tribes in Alaska also have these same stories. But what's remarkable is what do these stories have in common? So all of them seem to have, they all have the common theme of that was done by water, that God flooded the earth and destroyed mankind, because in a lot of them you have because of transgression. Some have that this came by this was divine destruction, that there was this favored family. Like that is just such an odd thing, that if this was all made up, why would it be about this one family that was favored? And then we also have that there was a pathway to get through it for this family, an ark that was provided, or a boat, or something to that extent. And that, again, when we think about this family, that's the way humans were saved, were in this ark or in this boat that they created, and that animals were saved through it. I mean, think about it. We are talking about people that are separated by continents. Yet the main themes of this are consistent through most of them. And that when they landed on a mountain, that's pretty specific to the biblical story. And then also we have that birds were sent out. The survivors worshiped when they came off of the ark. And then this divine favor on those who were saved. Think of it. This is across the whole world. We have these tribes who we would classify as uneducated and not learned in any sense of the word. Yet they have the same type of story of a flood. And they may not have all of it accurate over the time it's been passed down, but the fact that there is any mention of a flood at all is astounding. And that it's all over the world. So what do we see this? We see this, the core story is the same. There was a flood, there was a warning, and there was preservation of a family. Animals were saved, and that this was global. And it's separated. Through separated people, they have this shared memory. And we see evidence of this in Genesis chapter 11. As they spread out, this story would have went with them. And so this absolutely, is a testimony to the fact that the earth was flooded. But does the earth reflect it? Because I think that is probably the biggest question that we all have. Does the earth actually reflect a biblical flood, a cataclysmic event that would scar the earth and show its evidence forever? And I want to start here. Many of you probably remember when Mount St. Helens erupted. So the point we're starting here is because the general narrative is that these layers that are laid down, when we look at, let's say, the Grand Canyon or any kind of geological site, we talk about there's all these layers, and each layer was put on top of the next layer over millions or billions of years, and it was this slow process. So in Mount St. Helens, you had a eruption, you had a cataclysmic localized event, but what happened was the exact same thing that we see in the Grand Canyon. Over a 3-hour event, you have stratification, you have layers that put out at different levels, and they turned into rock. This is over a 3-hour event. You have the same things that we see in the Grand Canyon. Trees were buried upright, just like we see fossilized trees all over the globe, and canyons are carved. And what's really fascinating is that Mount St. Helens, you have canyons like this done in less than 3 hours. Now, Think about waters from a global flood, the power that would have. This is just a small volcano in a localized area. But think about the evidence that would be left from a global flood. And that's where we want to really think about the layers and the canyons that have been carved and the reshaping of a landscape. So the picture on your left is what happened after Mount St. Helens. That this was just hilly ground. There was no valley here. And then the eruption happened, and all of this happened in 3 hours. On your right, that is a picture of the Grand Canyon. There's a lot of similarities to this. So does one look like it was older than the other, or one took billions and billions of years than the other? So we have this evidence of that it can happen quickly. So that just takes one of the legs that the secular scientists stand on, that it had to happen over millions of years. That no, it doesn't, because at minimum, Mount St. Helens puts some doubt into that theory. But on top of that, we need to think about the Grand Canyon itself and how it is a testimony to a flood and not this erosion over millions and billions of years. Because in the Grand Canyon, for one, you have something that is a mile deep in places from the land that's the flat land above it. It's hundreds of miles long, and it has massive flat layers. So it all draws on some of these, just how could a small Colorado River do this over millions of years? It really doesn't make sense when we think about this without the presupposition that we come to it knowing that it happened after over billions of years. So we're told that this small river makes this over millions of years, but there are some serious questions with this and some serious issues with scientifically how could this be possible. So the first one I want to point out this morning is that the Grand Canyon is sat on, it runs through a bunch of these high plateaus. And when we think about where the Grand Canyon goes, so these lighter colors are lower elevation. The darker colors are higher elevation. What's interesting is you see it cuts right through this super high elevation right here. Now, when we think about water and how water travels, water takes the path of least resistance. So if water was just if a creek or a stream was gonna run up against this and you had this connected, it would either go this way or it would come down this way. It would not cut through it because it would just be pushed one direction or the other. You can go home and dig a mound in the dirt and run your water hose and see that it's not going to run open over the mound. It's going to run around it. So, but this river supposedly cuts directly through it. Instead of going around natural barriers, it went directly through them. And the uphill issue is that this Khabib Plateau is what this is called. This Khabib Plateau is a massive uplift that's thousands of feet higher than the surrounding land. So highly elevated versus the majority of the land that is around it. So the question is, if this forms slowly, why didn't the river just go around it? Why didn't it just take the path of least resistance? Why would it cut through higher ground that it wouldn't be able to get up to? It just doesn't make any sense. And any explanation that is given, these different ideas that they have tried to work through this, is that the river was joined with other rivers and that gave it enough force, but that still doesn't answer thousands of feet of elevation that you overcome. And that maybe there was underground pathways. So maybe it started digging it from the bottom and worked up. But how does water work up and erode something that it doesn't come in contact to? So let's take the theory. Let's give them that maybe it did cut through it. Okay, it cut through it. What about the rest of it? Why wasn't there just a hole or archway that was there? So there's some serious holes in this ideology that this happened over billions and billions of years. And another issue that we have is that we don't just have this here. We have what are called these water gaps all over the earth. You have areas where you have low-lying lands running into mountains that are then cut through the middle of them with a small stream where, again, if these were mountain ranges and they're the highland, rivers run around them. You go to the Flint River and you see how many turns it takes. It's because it's running up into higher ground and makes a turn. Runs into higher ground, takes a turn. This is what rivers do everywhere we have that we see rivers. But yet we have thousands of these places where the rivers cut straight through the mountains. And why would slow erosion do that? It doesn't make any sense. We're talking about something catastrophic to be able to cut a hole in a mountain like this. But one thing that we do agree with, those who look at the young earth and biblical flood, and what we agree is that there is massive erosion. You can't argue that. There is. We see erosion. But the question really boils down to how quickly were thousands of feet of material removed? And so the question really isn't like, how or excuse me, not if, but how and how quickly. Because the argument of such a long period of time doesn't stand up, because again, we run into these issues like we saw with the higher elevation. So the stronger explanation is, it comes from this idea of channeled flow. So water, when it channels up and it flows, the drainage that it then causes, it channels and intensifies and it carves quickly. It's exactly what we saw with Mount St. Helens. When it erupted, you had that pyroclastic flow that channeled, and then when it was started moving and it started just eating at the land below it and created the same type of thing we see at the Grand Canyon. So if there were sediment layers, so we think about the flood, all the sediment has been stirred up and the earth is starting to settle. And if it's laying down, it hasn't become as the hardest rock is going to be yet. It still is going to take some time. Now we're talking over the course of a year, when this starts to drain, now you have rock that isn't as hard as it is now, but you have water then receding and going back to where it came from. So what does the water always do? It follows the path of easiest resistance. So all around the earth, what we see is that these cracks that would have been formed as the sediment comes down and the water's receding, cracks, you then see channels cut through the center of these cracks. We think about the San Andreas Fault, how it looked. I mean, it is not the San Andreas, the one in the Atlantic Ocean that is the deepest part of the earth. The part of there's the part of the Atlantic Ocean that is deeper than Mount Everest is tall, and that it is literally a channel that has been cut by moving water. Thank you, Marianas Trench. Thank you. We see this as well underwater. So these cracks become channels. Those channels concentrate the water, and then the concentrated water becomes a powerful cutting source. And so what you're looking at here, this is what the scientists now who are stepping back and trying to, let's just look at the evidence that is there. Let's look at the topography. Let's look at, okay, if there was a flood, is there any evidence that, okay, where did this water come from that then carved this huge channel that we call the Grand Canyon? Well, just northeast of the Grand Canyon, you have these three lakes that you can see by how, from topographic maps and through imaging, you can see where there's evidence of water that was standing in these places. And what they say is the most likely thing is that all of these, as the waters receded, these lakes were formed. And how long these lakes were there after the flood, we're not 100% sure. But what we are fairly sure, and there's lots of evidence of these spillways, is that on this end over here, at some point, you had a breakthrough. You had a creek that was, trickling over it, that over time, like a dam breaking. Once you get some water going through it, and then that it starts moving quicker, and then it blows out. And that is what they believe has happened here, is that down on this end right here, you have where one of these blew out right here at the beginning of the Grand Canyon. And then all of these lakes empty in a matter of hours versus millions and millions of years. And just like over hours, Mount St. Helen changed the face of the earth, the same thing here. Over a course of hours, you have the Grand Canyon being developed from a huge flow of water versus millions of years from a small Colorado River. So the main purpose of this is I want us to see that just because the world says it and they have presuppositions, it doesn't mean that it's true. There's a lot of research that has been done on this. There's multiple Christian organizations that are looking at this and trying to evaluate all of the evidence without the presupposition that it happened by millions of years. Let's just take the evidence and let that direct us. But it still leaves me with a question, and I'm sure it probably does with you. Where did the rest of the water go? Like if we have the whole earth covered in water and we still have 2/3 of the earth covered in water, but we have all this land above it, we're missing some water. And where did it go? And that was a question that scientists have, people who trust in the Bible but are also scientists, they have fought with for a long time. Because that has kind of been that, you know, the bloody glove, for lack of a better term. This has been that is the last piece that we have been missing to be able to show that no, this did happen. Until a few years ago, that jumped ahead too far. A few years ago, scientists discovered the evidence of a massive water reservoir hidden under the earth by over 400 miles deep. So when God said the waters from above or from below came up, this is likely where it came from. So 400 miles beneath the earth's surface, and it's contained with a blue mineral called ringwoodite, and it's located in the mantle's transition zone. So we're talking, this is deep, deep. And this reservoir is not just free liquid water, it is located in rock. So all this water is trapped inside this sedimentation, which would make sense as well if you think about the flood. It would have taken a long time for that water to settle out and have clear water. So as the water's receding, it's going to be taking sediment with it that would then harden into rock over time. So, but this, what really is to me, the most amazing part of this is that the water underneath is 3 times more water than we have on Earth now. Is that enough water to cover all the mountains? You bet it is. 332.5 million cubic miles of water. That is hard to fathom. A cubic mile, so a mile, and a mile, yeah. So much water. So that's been the missing link that we now know is there. Evidence proves that it's there. So what does this do for us? This is not what is this isn't what makes our faith. But these are Christian evidences. You know, we're not called to have a blind faith. We have the record of the gospel, which is a better historical account from a ancient figure than any other figure that has ever been historized through the writings of men in the person of Jesus Christ. We have the history of his life, how he lived, written nearer than almost any other biography that is written by an ancient person. Yet people accept the ones about the ancient persons, but the one about Jesus Christ they reject. So what does this do? This helps bolster our confidence in what we already believe. This helps puts us at ease. This arms us to fight against what they will teach in the secular schools, so that we can then subvert these lies of the devil that the flood never happened. It was just localized. It was not just localized. These, I focus really just on the Grand Canyon because that's here in the U.S. and we see that and that's something we're all familiar with. There are sediment deposits that cover all 7 continents. The same type of rock that is spread all the way over. The same rock that we have here, there's some of the same rock in Russia, which evolution, that makes no sense why it would be there, unless you had this homogenized flow of water that settled across the whole earth, and you have the same layers at the same depth in different parts of the world. So this just gives us the ability to fight back against it. Because just as Peter said in the first century, that about those who were scoffing about the time of his coming, he then tells them, for this they willfully forget, but by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. We see evidence of the first judgment, which gives us the ability to anchor and know that the second judgment is coming. The question is, are we ready for it? So, I know this is not a typical lesson that I give, but I thought this may be something that you would find interesting and it would help arm us. And I guess my mind's on it because I have a son who's in early school, and this is where a lot of those ideas get put in. And, we got members who got young kids. And, even though they're not here today, you may be able to arm them now to be able to discuss this and talk about it. And I would be happy to share any of the resources that I've used and found. The Creation Museum in Kentucky has tons of information about this that shows that just because the world has said something for so long does not make it true. It exposes the presuppositions that they have and how each layer is built on another presupposition that is false, and it just compounding and compounding. So this morning